It is a great privilege to give you this award on behalf of this college, but also on behalf of every American. Thank you for this project.
Thank you, Dr. McFarland and Professor Kent for the great work you guys are doing at Breckner. And this is incredibly humbling to get this and incredibly motivating. I was, making my to-do list and I got the call about this and I thought, well, I can't be like the Breckner Freedom of Information Award winner and not file some FOIAs this week. It's motivating on that level, and also you should know when a news organization gets something like this, that pushes the news organization in a direction that obviously is important to you and to me. So it's helpful on many, many levels and deeply flattering. And I've been really enjoying your school so far today. From the alligator, which was a little creepy, to the bat houses, to a whole nature preserve for orb spiders. I mean, I feel like there's a lot to discover here. So I've really been enjoying it. And I'm delighted to share this project with you. When I pitched it to my editors, I hadn't really thought this through well enough. About 6 months later, I was like, what have I got myself into? I just want to, cover a city council meeting or something. So, with no further ado, there we go. So this is Tunis, and this is a sunrise in Tunis, and I show you this because this, to me, reflects what's happening around the world as democracies are emerging. They are all adopting new constitutions, and in those constitutions are freedom of information laws. And it's a tidal wave of countries getting freedom of information laws in the last couple of years, from Macedonia and Albania to Morocco and Tunisia. And with so many doing it, the pressure is really on the countries that don't have it. Brazil didn't have one until very recently, and it was a great embarrassment to Brazil. And so it's a reflection of throwing off dictators, bringing in democracy. A crucial part of that is going to be to have freedom of information, or else it's not going to work. So one thing that we're seeing also is Africa is kind of the last continent to be adopting these laws, and one after another now you start seeing African countries with right-to-know laws and tremendous advocacy organizations working really hard to enforce these and make them work. And there's all kinds of logistical problems in these developing countries because, as you'll see, they're not computerized, they're not digitized, and so you can have a law, but who's going to go dig through all the paperwork? The US has the opposite problem with its freedom of information law, which is that the law was written in the era of paper and now everything's digitized. And so many agencies in the United States still require you to mail them a letter rather than even send them an email here. This is a video from Morocco, and I show it just so you can see the excitement in the Middle East over these laws.
علاش تردوا تقولوا لي الحقيقة؟ علاش؟ علاش بغيتي تعرف؟
علاش تخليوني نتسنى بلا ما يقولوا لي والو؟
وديها بسوق راسك. وعدونا بالإصلاحات في الهيئات وحتى حاجة ما دارت لينا. وخا كنخلصوا الضريبه. وهاد المعلومات ما كيعطيوهاش حتى الصحفيين وكيحسب لك غادي يعطيوها لك انت.
علاش غتسكت علاش؟
من حقي نعرف. معلوم من حقي نعرف.
لا ما غنديهاش فقرة.
وهاك مسكتة. الوصول إلى المعلومة اللي كتخص الحياة العامة هو حق مشترك من لكل المغاربة وحقنا نستعملوه.
نسولو عليه.
طالبوا به.
ونطبقوا حنا. دستور جديد فاتح يوليوز 2011 كينص في المادة 27 على أن الحصول على المعلومة العمومية حق أساسي بضمن كاع المغاربة. نستافدوا من هذا الحق نسولو، نطلبوا، نعرفوا ونطالبوا به. بعد ما انتك في الحق الوصول للمعلومة العمومية. منعت عليك معلومة عمومية راه ما سكاتها، توجه إلى موقع إلكتروني منظورين.com وبالضبط اللي يردوا لك المعلومة.
So there's this great excitement about something that maybe we take for granted a little bit here. And I find it very exciting to be a part of seeing what's going on there as well with these laws. So let me step back and I remind myself, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but why freedom of information, to have an informed citizenry, to hold those in power accountable, which is always a good time, have greater transparency in government, and as I remind myself, it's always a fight to find out what the government doesn't want us to know. And I consider the Freedom of Information Act my weapon in that fight. AP goes, and everybody else should also go well beyond documents using the Freedom of Information law. So photos of coffins coming back from Afghanistan, that was a big litigation that we went through to get those photos. And I think it's really important that those photos become part of what the public sees as a consequence of our foreign policy in Afghanistan, that there are going to be coffins coming back. Video, we saw at the appellate level, video of George Bush laughing during a briefing about what's going to happen when Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans, which as that disaster unfolded, that video did reflect that there was perhaps a lack of taking things serious at the federal level. Audio, 9/11, 911 tapes all the time. We use Freedom of Information or Public Records Acts to get those. And then really what I mostly am getting are spreadsheets so that we can use the data to tell stories. I got a spreadsheet of the Consumer Product Safety Commission testing vinyl lunch boxes for lead to tell the story that most of them didn't have lead, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission was assuming that nobody's going to lick their lunchbox, so they declared them safe. And as anyone with any kids know, they lick everything. Or I got spreadsheets from the Defense Department about military recruiters who were being charged with sexual assault, and the numbers were exorbitant because you had these young guys trying to recruit high school age kids, and they were allowed to be one-on-one in closed rooms with them. And after we showed this was happening, those policies changed. So FOIAs for many different things. In 1960, there were two countries with freedom of information laws, Sweden and Finland. Colombia actually had it in their constitution for a few hundred years. The US adopted their law in 1966. And by 1990, there were 14 countries with one of these laws. By 2010, there were 90. So it's just soaring. And today there's 105 countries and a couple more are coming. I had to count how many countries there are in the world when I did this project, so I'll give you the short, but there's about 200, and I say about because some countries go back and forth whether they're actually countries or not. But it's 105 countries have these laws or constitutional provisions, but it's the big countries that have them. So the big populations, for the most part, have them now. Egypt will be the next big one to come on board, but when China passed their law and India passed their law, at that point, most people on the planet should have access to their governments. And when I saw these numbers going up, I actually was just going to write a Sunshine Week story about how all these countries are adopting laws, but in a moment of great weakness, I suggested we go ahead and test them all. And so my editor, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And so then I had to think of the methodology of this, and I went to a number of professors. I went to Tom Blanton at the National Security Archive, some other experts, and said, how should we go about doing this? And I went to a transparency conference at Rutgers and tried to talk to other international transparency experts. There was no journalists involved in any of these meetings or conferences, but people who had done some surveys with freedom of information so that they could talk to me about how are you going to rate it? Make sure to count, how many days it takes. What if they return partial information? How do you divide up your categories? And then finally, what are we going to ask them? And we were all over the map. Should we ask for oil contracts? Should we ask some environmental questions? Should we ask something really easy, like how much are your administrators, your government administrators paid? Should we ask something really hard? How do we do this? And so with much meeting and consultation, we decided that we were going to be the first person to ask in every country well, to file a law, and what we decided to ask, because we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, let's find out how many countries, how many people have been arrested and how many convicted on anti-terror laws. And what was interesting about this is that after 9/11, most countries didn't have anti-terror laws at all. And so after the attacks, the United States and the United Nations forced these countries to adopt anti-terrorism laws. And so we were curious to find out how they're being applied. Nobody had tracked who's, country by country, how many are being arrested and convicted. So then there was this crazy week where all the journals, so then we translated our 6 questions related to this into 12 or 14 languages. And then this single week had all the reporters go out and file them. So prior to this also, I had reporters find out about their laws. I got assigned an editor and reporter for each country, find out about their law, how to file, write a little brief on how to file, which in the end we ended up publishing as well for people. So everybody was supposed to fan out on this one week and file them, and everybody has a different process. So in Liberia, you hand deliver a letter and you get a stamp on it, and in Mexico, you simply log onto a website and do it. In Portugal, you have to call and make your request first on the phone. In Japan, you have to get a certified letter sent from the Tokyo Central Post Office. And my phone was ringing all night long. This colleague in Hungary was having trouble figuring something out, or somebody in Angola was having trouble, or all over the world. It was a very busy week getting these sent out. In Angola, the reporter felt like asking a question, making a demand of their government was too dangerous. And so we filed that one out of South Africa. And in China, my colleague Chris Bodine asked the government, how do I file a Freedom of Information Act request? And they told him, you're going to have to file a FOIA to find that out. Which, don't just blame China, because I once asked the Defense Department for a video that they used to train people on freedom of information. And it was a video called Freedom of Information Act, the People's Right to Know. So I asked the Defense Department for it, and they told me I had to file a FOIA for that. And then I did, and they denied me, and then we had to appeal.
Wow.
Yeah, and their reason actually was interesting, if you want to really get in the weeds on this. They had cribbed off Casablanca in there, and so then they felt like sharing it would be publishing or disseminating, and then they'd have a copyright problem, so they had to cut out the Casablanca. Okay, so then began this period where every day or two I would get a little gift in my inbox. Hey, Portugal responded. Hey, Turkey responded. Then there'd be longer and longer waits. It was 105 countries, but it was about 600 FOIAs, because like in the United States, I had to send them to 6 different agencies. In Jordan, we went to the police and the Ministry of Security and the prisons. And so in different countries, slowly they would start coming in. A lot of what we got initially were just the, thank you, we received your FOIA and we're not going to meet our deadline and we've complied with the law notes. And of course I had to build spreadsheets and start tracking all this. And my colleagues, because of language difficulties and trust issues, I really was being a control freak on this. I didn't just set up a spreadsheet and have my colleagues put their responses in it and fill it in themselves. I really wanted to see every piece of paper that came to them, scan it and put it in myself. So we waited and waited, and 10 months later, 15 governments had responded with the full information we asked for within their legal deadline. 42 countries eventually answered most questions. Most countries, 55 of them, to this day have not provided us with any of the information we asked for. And Africa was the biggest loser. So, the World Bank and other funders often tie money to a Freedom of Information law. And so these countries will have a Freedom of Information law that is completely meaningless. There were other surprises. This was Guatemala. So they invited us to their center and said, what can we do for you? We have, we only have 7 days for you to comply. So, by day 3 after they received the letter, they had us in here and let's start looking through these things so we can get you what you need by our deadline. Established democracies like the US, United Kingdom, France and Norway were much less compliant. Peru, Turkey, Poland, these countries were quick and were doing their best. I actually have a FOIA in with the State Department that I'm 10 years into the request. I think I kind of want to have like a record unanswered. It's for about a terrorist group that doesn't even exist anymore. So the bottom line is we found that many promises of transparency have not been met, and that, as you were saying on paper, it's a pretty magnificent promise that you got 5 billion people with access to information, but it's not happening. One thing that was kind of cool was a lot of governments, information officers contacted us afterwards and wanted to know how their country had done, and they wanted to let us know that they were going to make some changes. And here in the United States, one thing that we were very critical in our reporting was that it's a paper-based system. And they told me, we're glad you wrote this because we've been lobbying to set up an online system, and now they do have an online system. So they felt like that pushed things in the right direction. The articles were delivered to all the members of parliament in the UK, to the United Nations, by in-house people who asked us for copies to send around. And then, really significantly, when we didn't hear back from countries, we went ahead and did the reporting like a good AP reporter to find out how many people have been arrested and how many convicted on terror charges. So we had the one story about FOIA, but then it pointed to another really big story. We found 35,000 people have been convicted. 120,000 people arrested, 35,000 convicted as terrorists in 10 years since these countries adopted their laws. And some of these people want to strap on bombs and go blow up a bus, but more than half, many more than half, were people who had done little more than blog, hold up a sign at a political rally, or otherwise express dissent. It was particularly the Kurds in Turkey and the Uyghurs in China who made up more than half of that 35,000. So we presented this in all formats, you know, photos, video, online, interactive. Here's our video.
Jagdish Sharma wipes away a tear as he describes the price he's paid for the right to know. He used India's Freedom of Information law to expose a corrupt village mayor. It led to a confrontation in which Sharma's daughter-in-law was killed. Who will look after these children now, he asks. The mayor has been indicted for murder, but only after Sharma used Freedom of Information laws a second time to discover police had been considering a lesser charge. One case among many, revealed in the first ever global survey into whether Freedom of Information laws work. In more than half the countries surveyed, they don't. The Associated Press wanted to know how many people had been arrested and convicted on terror charges. It put questions to all 105 countries that have right-to-know legislation. Only 15 answered in full within their legal deadline, and more than half, including China, didn't answer at all. China improved its right-to-know legislation because it had to, as a condition for joining the World Trade Organization. But it rarely allows it to stand in the way of the country's rocketing economic growth. Zhao Fengping used the law to show that the planned demolition of her mother's home in the city of Zhengzhou was illegal. But the local planning bureau simply ignored her. The house was torn down anyway, and this is all that's left of it. Campaigners like Tom Blanton in Washington say the global freedom of information movement will only succeed if people keep pushing their governments to open up.
I think it was Martin Luther King who said, laws just declare rights, but they don't deliver them. It's up to the people to go grab that law and make it work.
Not least perhaps in Washington itself, where the Justice and Homeland Security Departments responded to the AP survey 6 months late, with documents that had all the names blanked out. Martin Benedict, The Associated Press.
We also put this up on, we put all the documents up on the document cloud and made them open for people to see from their own countries. So they were in all different languages. Here's requests from Chile, Jordan, North Ireland, Germany, more. And then we made a Facebook page. And we asked people from around the world to tell us what we should request. And if we liked the idea, then we would make the request. And we began doing that. So out of Nigeria, someone asked for oil contracts. Out of LA, someone asked for Marilyn Monroe's FBI file to be redacted. And both of those turned into good stories for us. And in fact, I have we did about a dozen off that Facebook page, and it's still a live project. It's become a public mission. So in every country with the FOIA law, we continue to push people to return back there and let us know what it is they want us to be asking, and then we try to do the stories if we think it's going to turn into a good story. We get plenty of kooks who want to know, if there's a hidden nuclear site in their backyard or something. CIA is talking to them in their molar or something. AP got really proud of this project, and also it trained a lot of my colleagues around the world about a new law in their country. And so we've continued to push all my colleagues to use freedom of information. AP is the most common freedom of information requester within the media in this country, and the media requests about 10% of all makes about 10% of all freedom of information requests. We should do much, much better than that. So the US, as they said in the video, had one of the weaker laws, but they are now trying to improve. What kind of stories do we end up telling? These are just some quick flip-throughs that we've had recent successes with FOIA. Who's deported after immigration raids versus who gets to apply for asylum. What's happening to the wild horses in the West? These are US ones. Who enforces child labor laws? In Honduras last year I went down, there was a prison fire where 300 people were trapped, locked inside during the fire. We used Honduras's fledgling freedom of information law, and were able to show within 2 weeks after the fire, 3 days after the fire, that most of the people in that prison and most of the people killed had not ever been convicted of a crime. They were awaiting trial. In New Zealand, they had why they weren't extraditing Kim.com. I don't know if you follow this case, but New Zealand has a pretty strong freedom of information law. In Japan, my colleague used their FOIA law to find strong records that the authorities knew a lot more about the dangers of nuclear meltdowns prior to that earthquake. In Mexico, the Presidencias tracks deaths, but they don't report them, and so we used their freedom of information law to request it. And Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, we did a project where we found out who was involved in extraordinary renditions when the CIA is moving potential terrorists to remote prisons to interrogate them. And I just end with this, which is for me a picture I keep on my wall to remind me how important it is our readers are, and how we are, that's our whole mission, our whole responsibility, and what an honor it is to be able to write for others and have them gain information from what we're reporting. So thank you. Any questions? Not like the undergraduates. A lot of questions. Yes?
Which country's results surprised you the most?
Well, Guatemala is pretty surprising. That was the second time in my 25 years of filing FOIAs that somebody has invited us in to find the documents we want. That was pretty surprising. I like Mexico. I think it's surprising in this way. Your request is anonymous. So they don't know if the person making the request is a journalist, an advocate, or even perhaps the president. And so the response is much more streamlined. And you'll find in Mexico, different agencies use their freedom of information system to get reports from other agencies, rather than trying to go in the front door and ask for it, which takes a lot of bureaucracy. You just go online and make the request that way. So that surprised me. What else surprised me? Jordan surprised me. That's a country that has a relatively new law and doesn't necessarily reveal who they arrest or prosecute generally. North Ireland was very quick to respond, and I thought that was the people who they were arresting as terrorists was pretty interesting. Most countries actually surprised me as they came in or didn't come in. I mean, it surprises me that you would have this law and never respond at all. So, yeah.
What keeps your persistence and motivation going when investigative journalism, I know, is really a tough, especially when they're doing it on government and they don't want to comply? How do you...
It's constantly fun. It's always fun. Like last week, a friend of mine and I, we're doing this, we've been doing a lot of journalism about Honduras. And every time we think we've unraveled a thread, a new one comes up. So I got leaked this report that showed that their new national police chief used to run death squads and had been like prosecuted for running death squads. So we report this, and then we report the US government is not withholding funds, even though this appears to be a human rights violation. And then we find that somebody actually has just been killed by a death squad, and we track it back. I mean, you know, the threats just keep coming, and so it's fun and interesting.
Also, like for advice for younger journalists, like how do you find out all this information? What are your...
I've always started with like what's right in front of me. So, you know, here at the university, you know, you see stuff. You see somebody building something that looks pretty expensive and ornate, and you know they're cutting everywhere else. File a records request and for all the contracts, for all the brass doorknobs they're putting on. And, you know, so it's what's right in front of you. You see people getting drunk and being sexually assaulted and people looking the other way, or, you know, whatever it is. There's records on all those things. So, yeah.
Did you notice a difference in the responsiveness of countries that had the provisions in their constitutions versus a separate law or statute?
No, and I had thought, in fact, Open Societies and the Carter Center, when I was working on my methodology, asked me not to include countries with it in their constitution because they wanted to test just the ones with laws. That was their advice. But we wanted to see, and no, I did not find a difference. We had to write our request slightly different, but no, that didn't make a difference. And many countries have it both in their constitution and a separate law, because the law provides for technically how it's going to work. Yeah.
A few years ago, the AP had made a commitment to have a beat, an FOI beat. Are you it?
No. I'm actually now, this is another thing that keeps it interesting me. I've been at AP since '96, but every 2 or 3 years I get a new job. So I was covering the drug war for the last 3 years, and now I'm covering Northern California and Silicon Valley, and so everything is new again and very exciting. I just happen to really love freedom of information. I think it's just an incredible part of our society, and I was telling you earlier, I had heard about it in a college class and began using it in college, and have always, while I'm doing my regular beat, have some freedom of information requests in, and now I find myself needing to do it for colleagues who seem to think like, you know, can you please file and form me? Okay, you can probably do it yourself. I try to get people to do it themselves. But what AP did was we hired an exclusive FOIA attorney. And so all she does, she's got these desks covered with appeals. And she's particular about which appeals she does. She won't file them for us. We have 3,000 journalists, but she will do selective appeals.
You know, clearly the United States has more records requests than any other country because it's been around for a very long time. What recommendations would you have for improvement to the U.S. FOI based on your findings in the study?
Well, but based on my findings and my daily practice, it's to get everything online. I mean, to this day, most agencies have to provide me their records in paper form. Spreadsheet in paper form is not very helpful. And it's much quicker for them to shoot me the spreadsheet via email. So that would be the huge piece. Sometimes they send me a CD. The same thing, like, don't send a CD, send me the records. It's 2013. And we should be able to make the request online. And then they've just started this centralized requesting spot, but it's still not as slick as Mexico's, because in Mexico, you make your request. I want to know XYZ, and then somebody who understands all the agencies of that government decides where to send that request. So here in the United States, you have to know, I want this information from the Gainesville PD. And they may say, no, that's over in the jail, or that's with the sheriff, or no, that was a federal agent who came in and did it. So you make your request, and then it's not to the right place. I mean, if the US could have a system where you make your request, and then someone who knows the correct agency passes it on, that would be hugely beneficial. And I mean, at that level, they also have, in Mexico, they have the state versus the federal. I mean, if someday it could boil down to you make any request you want, like our Facebook page, and then we figure out where to make it. That would be very, very helpful. And then the main thing that I really would love to see is anything anybody requests and is turned over to them, and some federal agencies are doing this now, show everybody. Don't make us all request it. It's a waste of everybody's time. Maybe give someone 2 weeks to have it before you show everybody, but eventually just put it out there.
Because a lot of information was up and available online, and then along came September 11th, and agencies and governmental bodies were just ripping stuff back off. And so then they use that now. National security, gets sort of weighed into every FOIA request.
But now, a lot of times, they're putting up a lot of information, not a lot of context with it, but there's data.gov, an initiative of the Obama administration that has been attempting to just put their data out there and let people churn through it. But after 9/11, the Transportation Security Agency had a website that showed airport breaches and how many attempts to get through different airports with weapons had worked or hadn't worked. So I grabbed that data set and then I did a story, but they had pulled that data off the web, and they said it would be really dangerous for AP to report which airports had more security breaches than others. And I was like, guys, it already happened. Look what happened. So we went ahead and reported it, and then I found myself on Schedule D, which was a list of people who were unsafe to fly. So every time I go to the airport, a police officer would have to come over to the check-in counter and meet with me, and then I'd go through security, and then I'd sit down at the gate, and then I'd have to meet another police officer, and then I'd get on the plane, and then I'd have to get off the plane and go meet one more police officer. And this went on for some time until they got me off the list. And I remember sitting there with a baby on the plane, and then they're like, "Can you get off the plane?" And I had to go off, talk to the police officer, come back, and the guy sitting next to me was like, "What?" And I was like, "Let me tell you this story." And I told him, I don't think he believed me.
Okay, well, please join me once again in thanking Martha.
Thank you.
There's a lot more food and dessert and everything, so go back and grab something on your way out. And thank you all again for coming.